Thank you, Justin, and good afternoon. Good day to everybody. Um, all the best of the holiday season to each and every one of you, and thank you for attending the fourth GHY University class for 2013. Today, as Justin outlined, we're talking about the role of corporate leadership related to integrated trade compliance strategies. This was our third white paper, and I'll make other references to that a little later on as we go. But let's kind of frame what we're going to cover and deal with here. I know the audience, especially the GHY customer audience, understand the importance of trade compliance. So my presentation today has been designed in the language of senior leadership to help you build a connection between your world and that of the senior leadership that you need to get to understand the importance of your world. So hopefully, at the end of the day, I hope you walk away with the ability to be able to articulate the importance of your role within the organization to the senior leadership and their responsibilities within their role related to that. But so here's how we're going to unpack the discussion today. We're going to talk about the trade is expanding rapidly as companies look at their global opportunities to grow. We're going to explore the supply chains and markets and how they're diversifying beyond North America, just as the free trade agreements are. We're going to cover off regulators are more aggressive than ever before in compliance verification. We'll talk about how many companies are not evolving their organizational structure to adapt to increasing global diversity and compliance demands, and silos within an organization create risk. We'll talk about corporate leadership's role and how they must view global compliance linked to their oversight mandate in strategy, risk, and branding specifically. We'll talk about how that this integrated, proactive approach is the antidote to surprises, risk, and future liabilities. And compliance is not only a cost of doing business, but an opportunity to create global competitive advantage. And as I said, I really want to help you make a solid case to your leadership that trade compliance is worth investing in commercially. So with that, let's dive in. It's no surprise that Canada is considered a trading nation. Our prosperity is directly tied to our ability to do trade. This is further amplified by the existing 12 trade agreements we have in place, including in 2012, the reactivation of the Jordan trade agreement, which was previously canceled. And today we have over 35 trade agreements in negotiation, a number of high-profile ones you've heard about recently in the news. If we really look at this and we look at the map, what we see is a wave of trade moving from the west to the east. And so with that, let's understand some of those emerging opportunities that we're talking about. There is, of course, places like the European Union with its 27 countries that has been recently in the news. Not to be ignored is, of course, the discussions with India that may well come to fruition in 2014. Along with Brazil, Japan, Korea, and of course, let's not forget the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes 11 countries beyond the North American Free Trade Agreement that's in place today. And those 11 additional countries covered by a Trans-Pacific Partnership open up opportunities in Australia, Brunei, Chile, Malaysia, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. To the south of us, we also see that expansion in Costa Rica, Morocco, and of course the Mercosur customs, including Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, that's expanding. And of course, looking at the Latin American agreement that's in place today and expanding beyond the agreement with Chile to include Colombia and Peru. And Thailand, not to be forgotten in there, and of course, some early discussions which began last year with China in beginning down this path. So again, we see this wave moving in understanding what's happening. So let's take a look at specifically what does this really meant. When we look at the data that's represented here, what you see is that there is a symbiotic relationship between import and export volume. That may be something that most people don't understand. The simple fact is that NAFTA and the trade impact associated with it is directly tied to the GDP growth of Canada as a nation. In this case, we're looking at stats from 1989 through 2006. And while there is a downward trend that you'll see on an additional slide for 2009 and 10, the fact is what you see is as we're coming out of this very obvious, very painful, very slow recovery is this upward projection that's slowly taking us out towards 2020. And in fact, what's really intriguing when you look at this is when you understand that folks like Dr. David Fung, who's a global value chain assembly leader, he's also chairman and CEO of the ACDEG group of companies and past chair of the CME. He suggests we're only seeing about 5% of the Canada-Asia trade that will develop in the coming decades. So certainly lots of future opportunity. Looking at that a little bit more specifically as we focus in on our exports and imports, when you take a look, we can see that downturn representing the economic downturn, but you can see the representation, again, the symbiotic relationship between import exports, but you can see how it carries out. Now, by the way, if you look at this and factor it in, we're really only factoring in at this point the impacts of the Canada, US, Mexico trade agreements, which are actively in place on the most used trade agreement across all of this. So again, we talked about the slow and steady growth, but the one key thing is that what we realize through the downturn, of course, is it really does amplify that old adage that as one nation, gets sick, that we all get the flu. So that there really is this economic contagion that happens. And of course, I think we now all clearly understand that. As we take a look specifically at the import, really trying to understand, are our supply chains diversifying? Well, according to the stats here, the snapshot kind of validates that, yes, while the US, with the NAFTA agreement, is our number one trading nation, the fact is that it used to be 75 to 80% of our volume. It's now down to about 50%. We have the UK and the EU, of course, represented by an emerging trade agreement that's probably within the next 18 to 24 months being ratified, is our number two trading nation today, and China and Asia coming in at number three. So, the belief is that this really does validate that, in fact, our supply chains are diversifying, and I'm sure you already know that, because I would suspect that many of your businesses have already gone through or are going through that change. The other one, in terms of where's the export destinations, where are our markets? Again, this is a very slowly emerging place for many Canadian organizations. When we look at the snapshot, we do see that, again, the US with the NAFTA agreement is number one. And while it represents a large portion there at about just under 74%, the fact was it used to be 85%. So again, it has changed dramatically. Pardon me, no surprise that the UK with the EU comes in at number two again, and Asia at number three. And again, this does really show that we are beginning to open up and diversify our export markets overall. But don't just take our word for it. According to a study done here by DFAID, or the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, they took a look out as to where does things seem to be going in terms of the projection outwards towards 2040. What is of interest here is notice that USA continues to be our number one market. China moving up to our number two market from our number three. India up to number four from our number 10 market, and Brazil up to number 9 from our number 15. We believe this does represent a significant diversification and entrenchment of globalization. You can probably validate that yourself just by considering, are you dealing with the BRIC countries of Brazil, Russia, India, or China today? I would think many of you may be. So in fact, you can already see that you are also seeing this growth externally. But if we take a look specifically at North America, this is traditionally how trade moves within the country. And I think it really presents some interesting understandings when we consider this as a continental production platform. So rather than looking at it as Canada trade or US trade, many international organizations start to look to regions of the world to create these continental production platforms. And we're really seeing that emerge more and more of how companies are looking at their their growth and trade development. Increasingly, we're seeing offshore inputs that are being sourced and incorporated, obviously, into finished products, which creates complications with a mix of origins, production, or value-added components, of course, as well as destinations. And while there's an increasing global supply chain, the US sales still remain dominant for many firms, but markets are becoming more diversified, as we talked about. In fact, today, 75% of the total trade is between Canada and the United States, with 25% globally. If we put that on an inverse and we look from a US filter, in fact, those numbers hold about the same. So that it's 75% of trade between Canada and US from a US perspective and about 25% globally. Now, this can have some very significant ramifications for NAFTA eligibility, and it must be considered at the exploratory stages in addition to the usual factors of FOB factory costs, foreign exchange, freight cost, and import duties. And we'll explore some of those other things a little later in the presentation. What you have to understand is that customs regimes will be focusing on your bill of materials to identify foreign content, make determinations regarding substantial transformation, regional content, and embargoed components. So, what is it the regulators really want out of this? Well, the fact is what they're trying to do is they're trying to drive down the risk of security. That's obviously been very clear since 2001 in North America. They're trying to drive down the number of errors, the cost of enforcement, and as well as the loss of revenue that they've been encountering. What do they want? Well, they want us to be more compliant. They want the trading organizations to be more efficient, to drive up the safety, and specifically to the revenue generated. You will never find that on a regulator slide. But as businesses, it's very important for us to understand that as the pressures due to volatile global economies come to rest at home and decreasing budgets, etc., their treasuries are under pressure in order to find ways to shore up the revenue that's generated. So regardless of the text behind it, you can be guaranteed that at the end of the day, they want to figure out how to make more money by ensuring that they're focusing on these other areas. And so really, when you think of global trade from a regulator point of view, they see it as a gold mine and revenue opportunity for them. Let's understand some of the complexities here. If we look at it from just a single nation, such as in North America, there is approximately some 40 other government departments who are involved in the trading matrix associated with doing business. So from a regulator perspective, they see gold mine in fines or penalties, as well as duty and tax as a simple level. And within the free trade agreements, there's origin and regional value content that creates additional risk elements that can generate revenue for them. Let's not forget that there's even some non-tariff related issues that come in here with permits, licenses, protection of your IP, your intellectual property, as well as labeling and packaging. And let me give you an example within this. So if you take a look at NAFTA as just a single offering within the regulatory regimes, it's been more than 10 years since it was fully implemented. Most companies have not redone their NAFTA qualification calculations, yet we know from the stats that we just looked at that global sourcing is much more common today than it was before. And therefore, that must have an impact on the regional value content calculations that went into determining whether or not products that were manufactured are in fact NAFTA applicable or not. The regulators know this. We are seeing a huge increase in NAFTA audits where the regulators are looking to recoup duties on non-qualifying goods. Let me share with you a specific case in point to demonstrate. Within the last 6 months, I was involved in a conversation with a large manufacturer who thought their regional value content for NAFTA qualification was at 90%. When they recalculated based upon their change to global sourcing, it was actually just at 60%, which is the minimum in that case in order to qualify. Now, for those of you that understand the nuances of compliance, I am led to believe that whenever it's a related sale, within an organization, there's a different formula that's used. But quite simply, you can see the assumption of what it was that made it NAFTA qualifying, as one example, no longer applies. So if we have this complexity in just North American trade, imagine the level of trade compliance that comes in when we multiply this by the number of trading nations that we start to do business with. So what is happening out there? I already alluded to the fact that we are seeing changes that are evolving. Now, as you can imagine, we don't have access to the regulators database. So we're sharing with you some findings from our own customer database, reflecting the values through 2003 through 2012. What we can tell you is all of our top Canadian and US clients have been audited multiple times. The global regulators have increased their surveillance. They're becoming very targeted. They're using intelligent analytics, diagnostics, and even more important, they're sharing results with each other, which is where we see the impacts of shared border accords and that. It's really the ability to share information across those borders that we're seeing. If you imagine a NAFTA certificate of origin, while you may get a request for a validation of that NAFTA certificate of origin, the fact is, others may be buying from that particular supplier. And if that's the case, if they find a fault within yours or somebody else's, they may come back and say, okay, who else are you doing business with that may in fact be impacted by that particular message. So again, it may not be something you're doing wrong or some kind of vigilance that you haven't kept. It may be somebody else who's dealing with the same parties in your supply chain that may in fact put you at risk. So you really do need to start thinking about how what you're doing extends beyond the four walls of your organization. We'll talk about that in a moment. If you kind of want a visualization, if you're familiar with the CBS TV show Person of Interest, where you've got kind of this geeky fellow who's written this program that monitors all of the global video feeds and information, looking for intelligence that the government needs to act on. Well, that's kind of a very big brotherish kind of approach. I mean, that's not what we're talking about in the present day setting. We're not watching the citizens, but what you can be assured is that the regulators are definitely watching your trade. And your trade activities from the point of origin to destination. So it's really just going forward with that understanding that there is this clear line of visibility that's being created. Now, if you're like me, I kind of look at it and go, hey, 2010 through 2012, the line's starting to look good. If I haven't been hit now, then I guess I got no worries. And I would caution you. I'd caution you to make sure that you don't fall into a false sense of complacency. Compliance complacency is really the regulator's best friend. And really, if you fall into that sense of compliance complacency, you are building a future compliance liability risk for your organization. So we really do need to ensure that we keep that top of mind. So that kind of, asks the question, so who is at risk within this? The simple answer is everybody. Not to the same degree, though. We typically have our low volume importers. They have less risk, less chance they will show up in an audit. And if you're a very large organization, chances are you always have risk. There's an assumed level of risk that goes with what you're dealing with it. So really, the largest risk basket are those mid-size enterprises, which makes up about 9,000 medium-sized importers into the country and probably represents many of you. And in fact, you're at the highest target. And so why is that? Well, the fact is that the reason it lies there is because in this environment, typically you may outsource portions of it. You may have low management buy-in to the importance of risk. You might not even have a compliance department. And therefore, from a regulator perspective, they see that as potentially easy risk. But here's the caution. You can't outsource risk. So your internal focus, if you have internal resources, you should be focusing them on risk management, not on transaction processing or transaction checking necessarily. So we'll talk in further in terms of some of that. So let's kind of get out of the theoretical for a moment and let's try and bring it back to a bit more real. Our observation has been that many organizations still operate in a silo model, where you have these independent silos of business functionalities and responsibilities that there is no kind of cross. Now, the problem is that where there are separate worlds and no coordination, typically means there is no level of visibility. And that means everybody's working ad hoc, which is another way to say that everybody's being reactive, which probably means you're dealing with surprises in your international trade, where imports are the focus of operations, exports are typically the focus of the sales. And the disconnect can have some very commercial consequences. And with that, I'd like to share with you two examples. In terms of a cost side, there's a multinational vehicle manufacturer serving markets in Europe and North America who failed to accurately classify a major component imported by one of their Canadian divisions. It resulted in an overpayment of duties of about $250,000 annually. And it's estimated that the impact of this omission after production burden costs and overheads were applied was double that amount at the point of sale, which resulted in margin erosion for them. Another aspect, which is really talking about this disconnect between sourcing and market development, is a client who had regional value content at 60%. And purchasing, doing the job of purchasing or sourcing, went out and sourced a motor component for the particular unit they manufacture and saved $50 a unit. Way to go. The sourcing purchasing department has done what they needed to, that they saved it. Now, the machine normally sells for about $50,000 when wholly manufactured. And the problem is that by changing the sourcing of that motor in order to save $50, they fell below that 60% regional value content calculation, which means that every machine that's exported from their Canadian manufacturing division now has an additional $1,500 in duty, which in order to make up means they have to sell 30 times more machines just to maintain their profit margins. So again, that can have a real large impact when we don't really have kind of the left hand, right hand talking about it. So what's the solution? Well, this is really what we presented in our very first white paper, labeled The Case for an Integrated Trade Compliance Strategy. It was an intentional connection between business units and external parties, linking vertical, horizontal, upstream, and downstream communications and visibility, really providing cost side accuracy and sales price certainty. And service providers, again, which are not just your customs broker or trade organization, includes your legal and financial and audit teams, among many others as well. So we look at things like duty drawback, audit readiness, or even more recently, as of January 2013, a number of folks have started to worry about the removal of some 70 countries from the GPT program as well. While it's supposed to be revenue neutral for them, if you're in the textile industry, you know that that's not exactly what has happened. So by looking at an integrated model and being proactive should mean that you have no surprises. So if we kind of stop that for a moment and we take a look here and go, okay, that's, it's all great. There's lots of great numbers and information, but I mean, reality, where do people go with this? Well, what we have to understand is if we look at this model, it really helps you kind of visualize where is your organization on this chart. We have risk on the left side, and we have the degree of integration on the bottom. And so the question is, large organizations typically are more integrated than small to mid-sized enterprises. And so what we hope to see is that everybody's moving towards that upper right-handed corner, where there's an integrated import and export model that deals with, creates low amount of risk for their organization, but has a high level of integration. The fact is, many people are in actually the upper left, that they probably are doing very well on either their import or their export program, but they're not necessarily in every case doing it on both sides. So again, the goal as an organization is to take a look and say, we would like to be in the right-hand corner. How do we get there? So kind of going back, in our second efforts in creating a white paper, which we had created these 7 best practices of leading traders, that was our second white paper in the series. That was a result of interviews with a number of leading companies in the agricultural, apparel, chemical, electronics, and manufacturing industries. And what we had learned from that and shared with everybody was there's really 7 best practices. What these leaders had identified was, number 1, trade compliance must be a priority for leadership. And that's the purpose of our discussion today. That leadership must appoint a trade compliance champion or team to deal with it. That's in fact the subject of our 4th white paper that is being published and is available today if you wanted to get an early read. Talking about the development of KPIs for trade compliance. Moving on to number 4, to create the systems to track and report on those trade compliance metrics. In number 5, developing intentional communication and meeting protocols to talk about trade compliance issues. Number 6, looking at the growth plans of the organization and ensure they factor in the trade compliance variables. And number 7 was to include your trade compliance service providers as business partners. And again, these partners include your financial, audit, legal, trade, and customs teams. So let's dive into that a little bit. When we took a look at best practice number 1, corporate leadership identifying trade compliance as a priority. Well, why is that the most important? Very simply, the tone is set at the top of the organization. Is the organization, from the tone at the top, a reactive organization or a proactive organization? Chances are, if they're not on board and they're not helping to guide it, the simple fact is that you will run into many, many obstacles along the way. And we've seen this published in the papers. We can take a look at a number of leading global organizations who are doing it right. In fact, their values are posted in their mission statement, which includes global compliance, because they associate global compliance as a level of accountability. And they see that being accountable to validating their brand promise. So again, they've actually taken global compliance and made this correlation to relate it to their brand promise. Very intriguing. On the flip side, organizations which traditionally have not had that kind of focus have enjoyed a lot of negative press. In fact, there's a number of public traded companies that we have unfortunately read about in the news over the past year or so, talking about a lot of corruption and bribery cases involving companies in Mexico. I was happy to see that there was a report out about mid-year, I think it was April, May of this year, talking about that actually made a very intentional change in terms of even the bonus and revenue structure for their executives that tied it directly to that accountability in order to address that kind of stuff. So let's dive in here and take a look as terms of why does your senior leader really need to worry about this and what is their role in doing that? And that takes us to understanding the role of corporate leadership. The first thing is governance. Senior leadership is responsible for the governance of the organization. Establishing what is the vision and mission of the organization, dealing with oversight from the CEO to the executive team, and ensuring enterprise success. According to the folks at the Chartered Accountants of Canada, they had this to share. They will oversee the processes that management has in place to identify business opportunities and risks. They will consider the extent and types of risk that is acceptable for the company to bear. They will monitor management systems and processes for managing the broad range of business risk. And most important, on an ongoing basis, they will review with management how the strategic environment is changing, what key business risks and opportunities are appearing, how they're being managed, and what, if any, modifications in strategic direction should be adopted. So that's what they believe in terms of what is the role of governance. The next one is strategy. and that is how we will achieve our vision, setting a directional roadmap for the organization, developing the objectives, accountabilities, and timelines associated with that. At the 6 o'clock position of the chart, we have risk intelligence. That's really understanding what could compromise the organizational success. What are the known and unknown factors? And what are the probabilities and contingencies in dealing with that? And finally is reputation or brand management or brand integrity. That's really many companies' biggest asset. Many companies' brand promise begins with a "we will" kind of statement. And at GHY, we talk about our brand promise in terms of care for our associates, our clients, and our community. These are values that measure success not by dollars. And really, that is the glue of success, is building trust, respect, and loyalty is what ensures it. And according to Eisner-Empner, USA, who does a survey of corporate directors, the number one risk now identified by senior leadership is the reputational risk, and it has overtaken regulatory compliance risk as their primary concern. Now, saying that, what I want you to understand, because I've presented to this audience before, is that social media represents an emerging factor that has both good and bad risk associated with it, and also needs to be factored into your organization's play. So, how does globalization intersect with these responsibilities? Well, it's a balancing act, to be quite honest. According to Daniel Wagner, CEO of Country Risk Solutions, he shares this insight. As company operations and holdings continue to expand into all corners of the globe, decision makers too often pay too little attention to specific country risks and other matters of critical importance. Boards of directors are particularly vulnerable to this glaring oversight due mainly to a lack of direct insight into a particular country, which leads to an inability to discern fact from fiction and not knowing the right questions to ask of corporate management. So in terms of understanding on the strategy side, we have both our market strategy, which is really your revenue growth diversification strategy, and supply chain strategy, which is looking at your cost competitiveness and your cost certainty factors. On the risk side, we have commercial risk, which is really your competitive risk. And of course, the regulatory or compliance risk that we've been talking about so far. So let's put some of these pieces together and help you understand some case studies as to how these things come together. I'll cover off a few examples to help you understand what some of the implications could be of this. Probably the first one I'd like to talk about is the shifting production from North American to overseas facilities, offshore production. And while it may be economically attractive and make commercial sense from a standard due diligence perspective, but what if the operation suddenly rendered useless by a natural disaster and there is no contingency plan in place? That may seem far-fetched or a black swan kind of scenario, but consider what happened in 2011 to international supply chains of companies that were disrupted for several months by the unforeseen tsunami and nuclear meltdown in Japan, or the completely devastated by widespread flooding in Thailand. In fact, Japan certainly was a worse natural disaster, but Thailand was a worse economic disaster. Another example I'd like to share with you is rather unique, and that is that, if we talk about intellectual property and patents, while it's an emerging area of risk for North American firms contracting out their manufacturing or partnering with foreign companies, but liability can cut both ways in these cases, both to protect the Canadian or US firm from illicit use of their intellectual property by unauthorized parties, or by exposing the firms to foreign regulators enforcing domestic patents that may not be recognized by North America. And the final case study I'd like to share with you is a rather unique one because it presents the aspect of thinking of cultural risk in your market diversification strategies. And so while global expansion can expose companies to cultural risk, if the particular sensitivities of the country or region are not properly researched and factored into strategic plans, tales of hapless cross-cultural insensitivity are legion. For instance, consider the case of a successful U.S. manufacturer of golf balls looking to expand internationally and was puzzled by the unusually low sales of its product in the Japanese market, until it was eventually discovered that the problem derived from selling the balls in packs of 4. Turned out in Japan that the number 4 traditionally holds the meaning of death. Hardly a stellar way to build brand integrity or reputation in a new market. So when we take a look at this balancing act of risk and opportunity, risk really has responsibility to get a 360-degree assessment, looking at both the upside opportunity as well as the downside risk. And due diligence is really the expectation of informed awareness. Certainly from your senior leadership perspective, that's what they're looking for, is to know that they are informed and aware of the requirements to meet their obligations. And I think, as we all know, that ignorance is no longer an excuse with the regulators in terms of dealing with the implications. We must understand that leadership has to ask the right questions, but leadership must also put checks and balance in place to ensure that the business is running correctly. And why? Why would this be important to them? And why is it important to you? Because the consequences flow uphill as well as downhill. By case in point, I recall a situation where a board and CEO member of an organization needed help understanding some issue that was created by a third party. It was worth approximately $80,000 to $100,000 to them. We helped them unpack the case, but I can tell you that was a case where that leadership was very involved, very engaged in the conversation, because they understood the risk that they had to deal with. So how do you go about this? Well, we have what we call the 5A model. And so what we'd like you to do is consider how this relates in terms of organizational structure for your company and how it might be applicable. So let's take a look at the first part. When we take a look at the board has a responsibility to be aware of awareness. They have to know what they know, and they have to know what they don't know. And according to Christopher Eaton, from What Does Risk Integration Really Look Like?, he says some basic questions should be asked here, such as what factors will be included in the risk assessment? How will various risks be graded and compared to the risk appetite of the organization? What preventative measures are in place to avoid a breach of risk appetite? How will risk be mapped to strategic objectives? And what forward-looking key risk indicators will be most useful in decision making? So some interesting thoughts in terms of how does the board create that awareness? When we move to the CEO, what we really have is the requirement to build an accountability framework within the organization. Because really the ultimate responsibility for outcomes of the organization rests with the board and the CEO. And according to the folks at Deloitte, from their Risk Intelligence Governance Guidebook, we share the following quote: "The board should establish and reinforce executive accountability for risk management. One way to do this is to expect full disclosure by management of the risks associated with each aspect of the strategy. Given management's ongoing feedback about your satisfaction with their level of disclosure and the quality of risk-reward analysis, you might also consider a formal evaluation process led by the board chairman, lead director of governance committee, or other specific executives who are appointed with that responsibility." As we build it out, you bring in the executive team, and their responsibility is to create alignment within it. So if the CEO is the quarterback in enterprise risk management, or ERM, then the executive team is the team that needs to follow the plays and make it happen. Each area is responsible for their specific functional risks. Dealing with the coordination and communication is essential across the organization, and whether that's done through a risk committee, risk officer, or a cross-functional team is up to each organization. and the responsibility to send the information back to the board to inform them on a regular basis. The rest of the organization has a responsibility for assessment, because really the enemy of vigilance is really complacency. And according to Kathy Taylor from the Conference Board of Canada in her Risk Watch quote, we take the following insight. Complacency results from the abandonment of critical thought. Sticking to the status quo and refusing to challenge assumptions may appear to reduce conflict, but at what cost? Critical thought is the flashlight that exposes the cockroaches hidden in the corners. Potentially disastrous flaws in strategies and activities are missed when we choose to remain in the dark and limit the participants in the debate. And across the entire organization, there's also the responsibility for adaptability. I think it's no surprise that globalization is rapidly evolving the supply chain as well as market development. And while the temptation is to default to the commercial metrics, we would caution you against that. Slow the process. Ask the questions before something's done. According to the folks at Ernst & Young in their risk oversight in emerging markets, we share the following insight. The most important thing the board can do in overseeing risk in emerging markets is to continually exercise skepticism regarding the company's plan. Growth prospects in emerging markets are so seductive that many management teams formulate plans too hastily, without paying sufficient attention to new customers, competitors, and regulators in those markets. So in summarizing that, the board has a governance and awareness responsibility. The CEO and executive team have the strategy oversight and accountability, and the executive team has the risk intelligence and alignment responsibility across the organization, the 5A model. So let's take a look at how three organizations have adapted to this world and looked to the integrated trade compliance strategy and made their own version of it. The first example I'd like to share with you talks about a large organization. They're US based, they're publicly traded, and they're in the agri-food sector. They have a corporate priority involving the global CFO and a team in support of that. They have both country and regional champions. They have regular team meetings and conference calls. They are subject to multi-OGD screening, and all of their product movements are tracked and monitored. They correlate the investments in trade compliance to the correlation of risk consequences, which to them is their brand reputation. In a mid-sized organization, they're Canadian-based. They're a private firm, and they're over 50 years old. They're in the chemical and allied products industry, dealing with both North American and global markets. And they have a compliance champion. And they saw this as an investment in certainty. And the roles of that champion, they track product movements, they map compliance metrics, and they coordinate all communications related to trade compliance, both within the organization and with outside partners. And finally, from a small to mid-sized organization, we'll use an example of a Canadian-based firm. They're also private. They're in the garment industry with Canadian and Southeast Asian plants. The president is directly involved with the sourcing and sales in this organization. They're a very close-knit operations team with a compliance leader. And the compliance factors are tracked and reported within the organization. And because their organization, not unlike many of ours, consider themselves very cost-driven, every penny counts. And so they see the investment in compliance in ensuring that they're meeting their requirements to be as cost-effective as possible. So that leads us to brand or reputation, because our brand is our reputation. It's everybody's responsibility within an organization, but ultimately, leadership's accountable. And with a complex global business, it can impact your brand. A broken promise equals brand degradation. And that could be a broken promise in terms of price, quality, service, or integrity. And according to the folks from Watchell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz and their risk management and the board of directors, they share this insight. Through its oversight role, the board can send a message to the company's management and employees that corporate risk management is not an impediment to the conduct of business, nor a mere supplement to a firm's overall compliance program, but instead it's an integral component of the firm's corporate culture and value generation process. So we've covered a lot. And you might be asking, okay, where do I go? What do I do? How do I fit in? So here's a little test. I want you to score yourself. The answers are easy. It's yes or no. Answer these 6 questions. Is global trade compliance currently a significant priority for your board? Is your board aware of the implications in its international trade activities at all levels? Do your strategic plans routinely incorporate the various risks and opportunities associated with globalization? Has a qualified individual or dedicated team been charged with overseeing trade risk assessment with respect to your organization's international sourcing, export market development, and/or global supply chain activity? Are procedures in place to track, monitor, and report international trade compliance risk variables at the board level? And finally, is there a process in place to analyze new growth strategies in emerging markets and assess potential international trade risks prior to business decisions being made? Now, I said to keep track of your score, so let's take a look at how you might rate with that. So in terms of your self-assessment, where do you fall on this chart? The first 2 questions I asked are really the most important in terms of today's topic of leadership role. And if you answered no to these first 2 questions, which were, is global trade compliance currently a significant priority for your board? And is your board aware of the implication of its international trade activities at all levels? And in this case, if you don't have a board of directors, you may have a senior leadership team. You can replace that. If you answered no to both of those questions, then you're most likely living in a reactive environment and you have the potential for a lot of trade compliance risk. If you answered yes to the first 2 questions and you have between 1 and 3 yeses, then you're making progress. You probably fall right in the middle. If you answered between 4 to 6 yeses, then you're probably proactive. You are most likely a leader in trade compliance today. So hopefully that was helpful to you. So today, what I hope I've helped you with is the takeaways would be that your senior leadership must understand how global trade compliance can reduce and even eliminate risk and surprises to your organization. How trade compliance links with your company's leadership priorities around strategy, risk management, and branding. How an integrated approach is a good commercial investment for your company in getting it right for the present and future. And maybe I've given you an idea or 2 on how to go about making that happen within your company. Now, along the way, we've talked about the availability of certain white papers, and you can certainly touch base with us and let us know if you're interested in others. As Justin had alluded to, we will provide the white paper associated with this topic, the 3rd in our series. But if you're interested in the original white paper from 2011 on the case for an integrated trade compliance strategy, just let us know. I talked about the 7 best practices of leading traders. We can also make that document available to you. And of course, the one today that we'll make available to you is this one, which is the role of corporate leadership. Now, besides these specific white papers, we do have some other collateral if it's of interest to you. We do have a compliance matrix that details each role within the organization, their relationships to the organization, including the board of directors or senior leadership, in helping you understand who needs to work with who on what issues. We have a sample compliance manual. If you don't have one, you've been thinking about building one, we have a tool that we can provide to help you with that. For those that are going, hey, am I really getting everything I need? Then we can help with a review to make sure that, in fact, you, as an organization, you're looking at that. And of course, we do have tradecompliance.ghy.com as an ongoing vehicle talking about all aspects of trade compliance and all of the latest and greatest news that comes up. So wow, that was kind of a mouthful. So with that, I'll ask Justin to come back in. We'll see if there's any questions, and we'll be able to hopefully provide any additional insight.
If there's any questions at this moment, please, we advise you to use the Ask Question function right now, and we will answer anything that comes through.
So while we're waiting for some of these things to come in, what I'll share with you is some insight to what people ask for. A lot of folks go, what are the KPIs you manage your business? What systems are people implementing to deal with? And what other aspects are they dealing with? So those are a lot of key ones that deal with, and I think most of us can find things like when we look at the first one, KPIs that an organization focus on is perhaps the amount of duty paid or penalties paid, would be some simple. But how about the amount of money you're not paying? By managing your NAFTA program, do you know how much money you're saving? Does it justify the expenses that you're investing in resources to manage that program? That might be a different way to go about it. Do you have any correlation to to your organization in terms of the brand? We're working on developing a next white paper in terms of that topic for 2015, and we'll be kind of unpacking and delivering that. But those are typically what a lot of people ask. And in terms of this, every organization's unique. So the structure, the alignment, how you use the 5A model or the integrated approach really becomes different for every single customer, i.e. those three different size company examples I gave you were three different ways companies have implemented that kind of strategy and put them in. At this time, we're not seeing any other questions roll in. Just
muted.
As of right now, there are no questions, so I'll lead in with the closing. So thank you very much, Nigel, for that eye-opening discussion, and thank you all very much for attending today's GHY University webinar. As we stated, we will be sending out the recording of today's webinar, as well as the slide deck and the role of a corporate leadership white paper, as well as the survey regarding your experience. So GHY is incredibly appreciative of your support in growing this new GHY University initiative, and we thank you all very much for making this successful inaugural year. We want to make 2014 even better, so we ask that you please take that short 5-minute survey and help give you an even better experience for next year. So if you'd like more information or clarity regarding an integrated trade compliance strategy or those other resources that Nigel mentioned, please contact Nigel at nigel@ghy.com, and feel free to connect with GHY International on Facebook and Twitter as well. So thank you again for attending today. Please look for our upcoming webinars in early 2014 and have a very happy and safe holiday season. Thank you.